My name is Emily, and I've been a housekeeper for over 10 years now. I never thought much of my job. It paid the bills and kept my head above water. I worked for various families across the suburbs of Chicago, but nothing could prepare me for what happened in the old mansion on Willow Street. It was a chilly autumn afternoon when I received a call from a new employer. They needed someone to help maintain their large, historic home. The lady of the house, Mrs. Harper, sounded pleasant enough over the phone. She explained that her husband had recently passed away, and she was struggling to keep up with the upkeep on her own. I felt a twinge of sympathy for her and accepted the job without hesitation. When I arrived at the mansion, the first thing that struck me was its size. The house was massive, with tall, arched windows that looked out over the sprawling lawn. The interior was just as grand, filled with antique furniture and faded portraits of stern-looking ancestors that seemed to watch my every move. I could feel a chill in the air, but I shrugged it off as just a draft from the old windows. Mrs. Harper greeted me at the door with a warm smile, but I couldn't help but notice her eyes. They seemed distant, almost haunted, as if she were carrying the weight of a heavy burden. She showed me around the house, explaining what needed to be done. As we walked through the dimly lit hallways, I caught glimpses of mirrors that adorned the walls. There was something peculiar about them. They seemed to shimmer oddly in the low light. As the days passed, I settled into my routine. I dusted the furniture, vacuumed the carpets, and polished the mirrors, all while Mrs. Harper remained in her study, often lost in thought. I started to notice odd things around the house, faint whispers echoing through the halls and the feeling of being watched. I dismissed these sensations as my imagination, fueled by the eerie atmosphere of the mansion. One rainy evening, while I was cleaning the large mirror in the entryway, I felt a shiver run down my spine. I glanced into the glass and caught a glimpse of a woman standing behind me. She had long, dark hair and a flowing white dress that seemed to sway even though there was no breeze. I spun around, but there was no one there. My heart raced, and I tried to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light. The following week, Mrs. Harper asked me to clean out the attic. I was hesitant. The attic was rumored to be the most haunted part of the house. But I needed the money, and I couldn't say no. As I climbed the creaky stairs, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. The attic was filled with old trunks and cobwebs, and the air was thick with dust. While rummaging through the boxes, I stumbled upon a small, ornate mirror covered with a faded cloth. I couldn't resist. I pulled the cloth away and stared into the mirror. To my horror, the reflection showed not just my face but the figure of the woman I had seen in the hallway. She stood behind me, a faint smile on her lips, her eyes dark and hollow. I gasped and stumbled back, knocking over a trunk that spilled its contents onto the floor. I quickly covered the mirror again, but the image lingered in my mind. Was this the spirit of Mrs. Harper's late husband? Or someone else entirely? I didn't have the courage to ask Mrs. Harper about it. I feared what I might discover. That night, I lay in bed, the sound of rain tapping against the window. Sleep eluded me as I replayed the events of the day in my mind. The chilling image of the woman haunted my thoughts. I felt a compulsion to return to the attic and confront the mirror again, to uncover the truth. The next morning, I arrived at the mansion early, determined to face my fear. I made my way to the attic, my heart pounding in my chest. I uncovered the mirror once more, staring into its depths. This time, I didn't see just the woman. I saw images flashing before me, scenes of a family, happiness, and then darkness creeping in. The woman's face morphed into a look of despair, and I felt tears welling up in my eyes. Suddenly, I heard a voice, soft yet commanding. "Help me!" The words echoed in my mind, sending chills down my spine. I looked around, but I was alone. My instincts screamed for me to leave, but something kept me rooted to the spot. I took a deep breath and spoke to the mirror. "What do you want from me?" The air grew colder, and I felt a presence enveloping me. It was as if the house itself was alive, breathing, watching. I could hear the distant sound of footsteps, the whispers growing louder, but I could see no one. "Find the truth," the voice urged, sending a wave of fear coursing through me. I stumbled back, almost tripping over the trunk. My mind raced. What truth? What had happened in this house? Panicked, I dashed downstairs to find Mrs. Harper. I needed answers. When I reached her study, she was sitting at her desk, staring blankly at an old photograph. I hesitated, watching her for a moment. The sadness etched on her face was palpable. "Mrs. Harper?" I said cautiously. She looked up, her expression distant. "Can you tell me about the woman in the mirror? I think she needs help." Her eyes widened, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of recognition mixed with fear. "You saw her?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "You need to leave this house. She's trapped here, and if you're not careful, she might take you with her." I felt a knot form in my stomach. "What happened to her?" I pressed, desperate for answers. Mrs. Harper took a deep breath, her hands trembling. "She was my sister, Lily. She died many years ago under mysterious circumstances. I've been trying to uncover the truth about her death ever since, but every time I get close, it feels like she pulls me back." I was stunned. The woman I had seen was Mrs. Harper's sister? A flood of questions surged through my mind, but before I could speak, Mrs. Harper stood up abruptly. "You have to leave now, Emily. I don't want you to get hurt. She's been restless for too long." Ignoring her pleas, I demanded, "What do you mean restless?" The expression on her face shifted from fear to anguish. "She's trapped in that mirror. She wants to be free, and if you get too close, she might take you instead." Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the temperature dropped. I could feel the weight of the house pressing down on me. My instincts screamed for me to run, but I had to know more. "Please tell me how to help her." Mrs. Harper hesitated, her voice barely a whisper. "The truth lies within the house. You must find out what happened to her. Only then can she find peace." Feeling a surge of determination, I resolved to uncover the mystery of Lily's death. I spent the next few days searching the house for clues. I combed through old documents, letters, and photographs, piecing together a fragmented history. Each discovery deepened my resolve but also heightened my fear. One evening, as I sat in the dimly lit parlor, I stumbled upon an old journal hidden behind a stack of dusty books. It belonged to Mrs. Harper. The entries revealed a tumultuous relationship between the sisters, filled with jealousy, love, and ultimately betrayal. It spoke of a tragic incident the night Lily died, a confrontation that had spiraled out of control. As I read the last entry, I felt a rush of cold air sweep through the room. The lights flickered violently, and the air thickened. In that moment, I knew Lily was here, desperate to be heard. I could feel her pain, her longing for closure. With newfound determination, I rushed to the mirror in the attic, clutching the journal tightly. "Lily," I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness. "I know what happened. I'm here to help you find peace." As I gazed into the mirror, the woman appeared again, but this time she looked different, less sad, more hopeful. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with relief. "You've uncovered the truth." Suddenly, the mirror shimmered, and I felt a warmth envelop me, washing away the cold that had plagued me since I arrived. I watched in awe as the reflection of Lily began to fade, her face softening into a serene smile. "I can finally go," she said softly. "Thank you for freeing me." With those words, the air around me shifted, and I felt an overwhelming sense of calm wash over me. The whispers faded, the heaviness lifted, and I knew Lily was finally at peace. From that day on, the mansion felt lighter, the dark shadows receding into the past. Mrs. Harper thanked me profusely, her eyes filled with gratitude. I knew I had helped her, but the experience had changed me forever. I had faced the darkness, uncovered the truth, and brought peace to a restless spirit. As I left the mansion for the last time, I glanced back at the towering structure. It no longer seemed like a haunted house but rather a place filled with memories, both joyful and sorrowful. I had stepped into a world of shadows and emerged stronger, carrying with me the stories of those who had come before. My name is Sam, and I'd been working as a handyman and cleaner for years now, mostly in small towns across the Midwest. I'm used to fixing up old houses, clearing out basements, and dealing with all sorts of odd jobs that people throw my way. But nothing I've done so far could have prepared me for what happened when I took a job cleaning out an old farmhouse outside of Davenport, Iowa. It was early spring when I got the call from Mr. Fisher. He'd recently inherited a family property after his father passed away and needed someone to clean up the place. The house had been sitting empty for years, and it showed. Fisher was a businessman who had no intention of keeping the place. He just wanted it ready for sale. He offered me a good chunk of money to go out there and spend a week cleaning up the mess his father had left behind. When I first arrived, the house looked like it had been frozen in time. Everything was old and dusty, with furniture draped in sheets, the smell of mildew hanging in the air. It was a classic two-story farmhouse, with peeling white paint and a barn out back. Fisher had told me over the phone that his father had lived there alone for years before he passed, but didn't give many details about the man himself. I'm not a superstitious guy, but there was something about the place that felt off. As I started working through the clutter, it became clear that Mr. Fisher's father had been something of a recluse. There were stacks of newspapers from decades ago, canned goods that had long expired, and dozens of clocks scattered around the house, all stopped at different times. On the second day, while I was sweeping the dining room, I heard something strange. It was a low, rhythmic tapping, like someone was knocking from beneath the floor. At first, I thought it was just the pipes creaking. It was an old house, after all, but the noise persisted, growing louder and more deliberate. It seemed to be coming from the basement. I'll admit, I wasn't thrilled about going down there. Basements in these old farmhouses were always a mess, damp, dark, and filled with critters. But I figured I'd better check it out in case it was something serious, like a broken pipe or an animal trapped down there. The basement door was in the kitchen, a heavy wooden thing that creaked loudly when I opened it. The stairs leading down were narrow and steep, and as soon as I took the first step, that smell hit me, stale air, mold, and something else, something metallic, almost like rust. I flicked on the light, but the bulb barely worked, casting a weak, flickering glow over the space. The basement was cluttered, just like the rest of the house, with old tools, broken furniture, and boxes piled high. I could see that one of the walls had some kind of built-in shelving unit, lined with jars of who knows what. I took a deep breath and descended the stairs, flashlight in hand. That's when I noticed it. The tapping sound had stopped as soon as I reached the bottom of the stairs. The silence was heavy, almost unnatural, like the air had been sucked out of the room. I shone my flashlight around, trying to figure out where the noise had been coming from. I felt stupid for letting myself get worked up over a couple of knocks, but there was this uneasy feeling that I just couldn't shake. As I walked further into the basement, something caught my eye, a door I hadn't noticed before. It was small, almost hidden behind a pile of boxes, and it looked much older than the rest of the house. The wood was worn and cracked, and there was a strange symbol carved into the center, something I didn't recognize. It gave me a bad feeling, but curiosity got the better of me. I tried the handle, and to my surprise the door opened with ease. Behind it was a small, narrow room, more of a crawl space than a real room, and inside, sitting in the corner, was a single chair. It was an old wooden chair, the kind you'd see in a classroom, or maybe an interrogation room, and it looked like it had been placed there deliberately, facing the far wall. That wall. I'll never forget what I saw. At first, I didn't realize what I was looking at, but then the flashlight beam caught it, the scratches. Hundreds of them, covering the entire surface of the wall, all at about the same height. It was like someone had been clawing at the wall, desperately trying to get out. My skin crawled, and I felt the urge to leave, to get the hell out of that basement. But as I turned to go, I heard it again, the tapping. This time, it was louder, more insistent, and it wasn't coming from the pipes. It was coming from behind the wall. I froze. Every instinct in my body told me to run, to leave that house and never come back. But something, call it curiosity, call it stupidity, kept me there. I stepped closer to the wall, my heart pounding in my chest. I leaned in, pressing my ear to the cold, cracked surface. Tap, tap, tap. It was unmistakable now. Someone, or something, was on the other side of that wall. I pulled back, terrified. There was no way anyone could be behind the wall. The house had been empty for years. But before I could react, the tapping grew louder, more frantic, and then it stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I stood there, paralyzed, until the door behind me creaked shut. My flashlight flickered, and in that brief moment of darkness, I swear I felt a presence, a cold, oppressive force pressing down on me. When the light came back, the room felt different. The air was heavy, thick with something I couldn't explain. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I bolted out of the basement, nearly tripping over the stairs in my rush to get back upstairs. I slammed the door behind me, heart racing, sweat pouring down my face. That night I couldn't sleep. The image of the scratches, the chair, the tapping, it all haunted me. I debated whether to call Mr. Fisher and tell him what I'd found, but what could I say? That his father had some secret room in the basement where someone, or something, had been trapped. The next morning, I forced myself to go back to the house, determined to finish the job and get out of there as quickly as possible. But when I arrived, something had changed. The air in the house felt different, colder, heavier. As I walked through the kitchen, I noticed the basement door was slightly ajar, even though I was sure I'd closed it. My gut told me to leave, but I had a job to do. I made my way back down to the basement, every step filled with dread. The room with the chair was just as I'd left it, but this time, there was something else. On the chair sat an old, dusty photograph. It hadn't been there before. My hands shook as I picked it up and examined it. It was a picture of a man, Mr. Fisher's father, I assumed, sitting in that very chair, a blank expression on his face. But behind him, in the shadows, I could see something else. It was faint, barely visible, but there was no mistaking it. There was another figure in the photo. A man, standing just behind the chair, his hand resting on the wall. And then I noticed something else. His hand was scratched, covered in blood. The same scratches I'd seen on the wall. I dropped the photo and ran out of that house, never looking back. To this day, I don't know what was behind that wall or who the man in the basement was. But one thing's for sure, I never went back to that house, and I never took a job like that again. My name is Melissa, and I've worked as a live-in nanny for years now, mostly for well-off families in suburban New York. Taking care of kids is second nature to me. I've seen it all, tantrums, sleepless nights, teething babies, but none of that ever really fazed me. That is, until I took a job at the Whitaker household in Westchester. What happened there still haunts me to this day. The Whitakers were a nice enough family. Thomas, the father, was a high-powered attorney, and Meredith, the mother, ran her own interior design business. Their house was one of those massive, modern mansions you only see in magazines. Everything about it screamed luxury. But despite their wealth, they were down-to-earth people, or at least that's the impression I got during the interview. They hired me to take care of their son, Dylan, who had just turned 3. When I first arrived at the house, I was struck by how quiet it was. Too quiet, actually. The house sat on a large, wooded property, far from any neighbors, and the silence around it felt oppressive. Meredith greeted me warmly, and Dylan was a sweet little boy, shy but well-behaved. Everything seemed perfect. But as the days passed, I started noticing things. Little things at first that seemed off. Like the way Dylan would always look over his shoulder when he was playing, as if he was expecting someone to be there. Or the way his toys would end up in odd places, even though I knew I'd put them away. The first time I heard it was late at night. I was lying in bed, reading, when I heard the soft sound of crying. It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakable, the cry of a child. I assumed it was Dylan, so I got up and made my way to his room. When I opened the door, I found him fast asleep, breathing softly in his crib. Confused, I checked the hallway and the other rooms, but there was no sign of anyone else. I figured I was just tired, maybe hearing things. But the crying continued, night after night, always at the same time, around 2 a.m. I'd lie awake in bed, listening to it, the soft, pitiful wails echoing through the house. Each time, I'd go to Dylan's room to check on him, and each time, he'd be sound asleep. The strange part was, the crying seemed to be coming from somewhere else, somewhere deeper in the house. One night, determined to get to the bottom of it, I followed the sound. I wandered through the dark halls, my bare feet padding softly on the hardwood floors. The crying grew louder as I neared the back of the house, but I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. Eventually, I found myself standing in front of a door I hadn't noticed before, a small, wooden door tucked away at the end of a narrow hallway, half hidden behind a curtain. I hesitated, a sense of dread washing over me, but I reached for the handle and opened the door. Behind it was a small, dark staircase leading down to the basement. The crying was louder now, echoing up from below, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I didn't want to go down there, but something compelled me to. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and slowly made my way down the stairs. The basement was cold and damp, filled with old furniture, boxes, and forgotten belongings. The crying had stopped by the time I reached the bottom, leaving me in eerie silence. I shone my flashlight around, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Just dusty and used space. As I turned to head back upstairs, something caught my eye, a small, wooden door at the far end of the basement. It looked different from the rest of the house, older, almost like it didn't belong. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I couldn't resist. I made my way to the door, my heart pounding in my chest, and opened it. Inside was a small, empty room, but the walls, they were covered in drawings. Hundreds of them, all scribbled in crayon. Stick figures of children, animals, trees, and what looked like a family, a mother, a father, and a small child. But there was something disturbing about them. The figures of the mother and father had no faces, and the child was always drawn crying, with dark lines streaming down its cheeks. I backed out of the room, my breath coming in short gasps. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I rushed back upstairs, slammed the basement door shut, and spent the rest of the night wide awake. The image of those drawings burned into my brain. The next morning, I decided to talk to Meredith about what I'd found. I didn't want to alarm her, but I needed answers. I caught her in the kitchen as she was getting ready to leave for work. "Meredith, I have to ask you something," I said, my voice shaky. "Do you know anything about the basement? There's a small room down there with drawings all over the walls, drawings of a crying child." Her face paled. For a moment, I thought she was going to faint. She put down the cup of coffee she was holding and looked at me, her eyes wide with fear. "You went down there?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You weren't supposed to. No one's supposed to go down there." I was taken aback by her reaction. "What do you mean? What's going on?" She hesitated, glancing around as if someone might overhear us. "It's not something we talk about," she said finally. "That room, it belonged to our daughter." My stomach dropped. "Your daughter?" Meredith nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "Her name was Lily. She was Dylan's older sister. She died when she was 5. The weight of her words hit me like a ton of bricks. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. "What happened?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Meredith swallowed hard, her voice trembling. "It was an accident, or at least that's what we've always told ourselves. She fell down the basement stairs one night while playing. We found her at the bottom, unconscious. She never woke up." I felt sick to my stomach. "And the drawings?" "She used to draw all the time," Meredith said, her voice cracking. "After she died, we found that room. It was like she'd been trying to tell us something, but we didn't understand. We sealed it up and never spoke about it again. But ever since she passed, strange things have happened. The crying, it's her. It's Lily." My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to process what she was saying. But why? Why is she still here? I don't know, Meredith whispered, her eyes filling with tears. I think she's trapped. I think she's waiting for someone to help her. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing Lily's cries echoing through the house, haunting me. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't leave her like this, stuck in that terrible limbo. The next evening, after putting Dylan to bed, I went back to the basement. My hands shook as I opened the small door and stepped into the room with the drawings. I knelt down on the floor, my heart heavy with sadness. Lily, I whispered, my voice trembling. I'm here. I know you're scared, but you don't have to be anymore. It's okay to move on. For a moment, nothing happened. The room was silent, and I felt a sinking feeling in my chest, thinking I'd failed. But then, just as I was about to leave, I heard it, the softest, faintest voice, like a child's whisper. Thank you? A warmth spread through the room, and the oppressive cold that had filled the house lifted. The air felt lighter, almost peaceful. I knew then that Lily had finally found her way out. After that night, the crying stopped. The house felt different, warmer, more alive. Meredith thanked me, though she didn't ask for details. I think she knew, in her heart, that Lily had finally found peace. I left the Whitaker household a few months later, but I've never forgotten that house or the little girl who cried in the night, waiting for someone to hear her. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I think about Lily and wonder if she's finally happy, wherever she is. I've been a housekeeper for over 20 years, moving from one job to the next, cleaning up other people's messes. In all that time, I've seen my share of strange things, but nothing ever rattled me as much as what happened at the Tinsley residence in rural Vermont. The Tinsleys were a quiet, older couple, retired and living in a large, creaky Victorian house at the edge of town. I had been hired to clean their home twice a week, dusting, vacuuming, the usual chores. They were pleasant enough, though a bit distant, always keeping to themselves. The house, on the other hand, was a different story. From the moment I stepped inside, I felt uneasy, like the walls were watching me. At first, I chalked it up to the house's age. It was one of those towering, old Victorian mansions, with narrow hallways, sloping floors, and drafty rooms. The kind of place that made its own sounds, creaks in the night, groaning pipes, and the occasional gust of wind whistling through the cracks in the windows. It didn't take long before I got used to the noises. But there was one part of the house I avoided at all costs, the attic. The Tinsleys had never asked me to clean up there, and I was more than happy to oblige. It wasn't that I was afraid of heights or the dust, it was something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. There was a door at the end of the second-floor hallway that led up to the attic, and every time I passed it, I felt a chill run down my spine. The door was always locked, but it felt like someone, was behind it, waiting. It wasn't until my third week on the job that Mrs. Tinsley mentioned the attic. She asked me to go up there and tidy up some old boxes they were planning to donate. I felt my stomach knot up at the thought, but I couldn't very well refuse. So I agreed, figuring it was just another dusty room filled with forgotten things. The next day, I arrived early and made my way to the attic. The door was old and heavy, and when I turned the key, the lock clicked open with a loud snap, echoing down the hallway. I pulled the door open and was immediately hit with the musty smell of old wood and stale air. A narrow staircase led up into the darkness, and I could barely make out the faint light at the top. I grabbed my cleaning supplies and slowly climbed the stairs, each step creaking loudly beneath my feet. The air was thick, and I could feel the weight of the house pressing down on me as I ascended. When I reached the top, I stepped into the attic and switched on the small overhead light. The space was enormous, spanning the length of the entire house, with low beams and piles of boxes stacked against the walls. The light was dim, casting long, eerie shadows across the floor, but I forced myself to focus on the task at hand. I started with the boxes closest to the stairs, dusting them off and sorting through their contents, old clothes, photo albums, and forgotten trinkets. It was tedious work, but nothing out of the ordinary. After about an hour, I noticed something odd. No matter where I stood in the attic, there was always a shadow in the corner of my vision, just at the edge of the light. At first, I thought it was a trick of the weak bulb overhead, but the more I looked, the more I realized it wasn't just a shadow. It was darker than the rest, thicker, almost like a figure. I tried to ignore it, brushing it off as a figment of my imagination, but it was always there, hovering just out of sight. I told myself it was nothing, just the attic playing tricks on me. But the feeling of being watched grew stronger, more intense with every passing minute. As I continued working, I noticed that the shadows seemed to shift whenever I wasn't looking directly at them, like something was moving in the darkness. I'd turn my head, and the corner of the room would seem darker than before, the shadows stretching, growing. My heart raced, but I forced myself to keep going, telling myself I was just being paranoid. Then I heard it. A faint shuffling sound, like footsteps, coming from the far end of the attic. I froze, my hand trembling as I held a dust cloth. The sound was so soft, so subtle, I wasn't sure if I'd actually heard it, or if my mind was playing tricks on me. I stood perfectly still, listening. Shuffle. Shuffle. Thump. There was no mistaking it this time. Someone, or something, was up there with me. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly turned to look in the direction of the noise. The far end of the attic was shrouded in darkness, beyond the reach of the dim light. My eyes strained to see, but there was nothing, just the piles of old furniture and boxes. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, but the sense of dread grew stronger, more oppressive. I wanted to leave, to run down those stairs and never come back, but something kept me rooted to the spot, my curiosity, or maybe my fear, pulling me deeper into the attic. I stepped cautiously toward the dark corner, my eyes scanning the shadows. The shuffling sound had stopped, but the air felt heavy, like the room was holding its breath, waiting. I reached the edge of the light and squinted into the darkness, my pulse racing. And then I saw it. At first, it looked like nothing more than a shadow, a dark shape huddled in the corner, motionless. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized it was no trick of the light. It was a figure, crouched low to the ground, its back turned to me. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at it, unable to move. For what felt like an eternity, I stood there, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was human-shaped, but there was something wrong with it. Its limbs were too long, its body too thin, like it had been stretched and twisted. And its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, as if it had been broken. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, watching in horror as the figure slowly began to rise, its movements slow and deliberate, like it hadn't moved in years. It stood to its full height, taller than any person should be, and turned toward me. The face, if you could even call it that, was a void. No eyes, no mouth, just a black, featureless expanse. And yet I could feel it staring at me, feel its gaze burning into my skin. That's when the lights flickered and went out, plunging the attic into complete darkness. I didn't wait. I turned and bolted for the stairs, tripping over boxes and knocking over furniture as I ran. The attic was pitch black, and I could hear it, moving behind me, the soft shuffle of footsteps growing louder, faster. My heart pounded in my ears as I scrambled down the stairs, barely able to see in the darkness. I reached the bottom and slammed the attic door shut behind me, leaning against it, gasping for breath. The house was silent again, but I could feel the weight of the attic pressing down on me. The memory of that shadowy figure burned into my mind. I quit the Tinsley's job the next day. I told them I couldn't do it anymore, made up some excuse about needing to take care of family. They didn't ask any questions. They probably knew something was wrong with that house, but just chose not to acknowledge it. To this day, I don't know what I saw in that attic. Whether it was a ghost, a demon, or something else entirely, I have no idea. But I do know one thing. There was something evil in that house, something waiting in the dark. And whatever it was, I never want to see it again. My name is Emily, and I've worked as a live-in caretaker for elderly clients across the Midwest for over a decade. I've been in homes where people were on the brink of death, cared for those who couldn't care for themselves anymore. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened when I took the job at the old Darrow Estate just outside of Kansas City. The Darrow Estate was an enormous, aging mansion that sat on the outskirts of town, surrounded by overgrown fields and dense woods. It had been built in the early 1900s by an eccentric millionaire, and it had all the trappings of that era: grand chandeliers, creaky wooden floors, and countless rooms that seemed to lead nowhere. The house had fallen into disrepair over the years, but despite its condition, it still had a sort of haunting beauty. I had been hired to take care of Mrs. Evelyn Darrow, the last surviving member of the Darrow family. She was well into her 90s, bedridden, and suffering from dementia. Most days, she was completely unaware of her surroundings, barely able to speak. Her family had long since abandoned her, leaving her to live out her final days alone in that vast, decaying mansion. I moved into the house at the start of winter, and from the moment I stepped through the front door, I felt something was off. The air was thick with the smell of dust and decay, and the house was eerily quiet, as though it had been holding its breath for years. Mrs. Darrow's room was at the far end of the second floor, tucked away behind heavy wooden doors. I spent most of my time in that room, feeding her, administering her medication, and reading to her when she was lucid enough to listen. The house creaked and groaned constantly, but I told myself it was just the natural sounds of an old building settling. I'd been in plenty of old homes before, and I was used to the way they seemed to have a life of their own. But there was something different about the Darrow estate. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It started with the footsteps. Late at night, after I had put Mrs. Darrow to bed and settled in my own small room down the hall, I would hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoing through the house. They were soft at first, barely audible over the wind that howled outside. But as the nights went on, they grew louder, more insistent, like someone was walking up and down the halls just outside my door. The first few nights, I convinced myself it was just the old pipes rattling, or the floorboards expanding in the cold. But one night, the footsteps stopped directly in front of my door. I lay there, frozen in bed, my heart pounding in my chest as I listened. Whoever, or whatever, it was, stood there for what felt like an eternity, before slowly walking away. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, but the footsteps continued every night after that, always stopping in front of my door before moving on. I tried telling myself it was nothing, that I was just hearing things. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Then came the whispers. It started one evening while I was tending to Mrs. Darrow. She had been unusually restless that night, mumbling incoherently under her breath as I tried to feed her. I leaned in closer to hear what she was saying, and that's when I heard it, a faint whisper, just barely audible, coming from somewhere in the room. I looked around, but there was no one else there. The room was empty, save for Mrs. Darrow and me. I asked her if she had said something, but she just stared at me with vacant eyes, her lips barely moving. The whispering continued, growing louder, until it sounded like it was coming from right next to me. I jumped back, my heart racing. The room was freezing cold, and I could see my breath in the air. I ran to the window, thinking it had somehow blown open, but it was shut tight. I stood there for a moment, trying to catch my breath, when I heard it again. "Get out!" The voice was clear this time, a harsh, rasping whisper that sent chills down my spine. I spun around, but the room was empty. Mrs. Darrow lay still in her bed, her eyes closed. The whisper had come from somewhere else, somewhere close, but not from her. I backed out of the room and shut the door behind me, my hands trembling. I didn't sleep that night, too afraid of the footsteps, the whispers. Whatever was in that house, it didn't want me there. The next day, I was determined to finish my work and leave the estate. I had seen enough strange things in my time as a caretaker, but this was different. This was something darker. Something I couldn't explain. As I packed my things, Mrs. Darrow became agitated. She kept mumbling about him, the uninvited guest, she called him. I thought she was just confused, a symptom of her dementia, but the way she said it, like she was afraid, made my skin crawl. That night, I heard the footsteps again, but this time, they didn't stop at my door. They continued down the hall, toward Mrs. Darrow's room. I leaped out of bed and rushed to her door, throwing it open, expecting to find her in distress. Instead, I found the room ice cold, the air thick with the smell of rot. Mrs. Darrow lay in her bed, her eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. And there, at the foot of her bed, stood a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that were too long, too thin. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its face was nothing but a gaping hole, as though it had been hollowed out. The figure didn't move, didn't react to my presence. It just stood there, looming over Mrs. Darrow, watching. I felt frozen in place, unable to move or even breathe. The air around me was thick with a malevolent presence, and I could feel its eyes, or whatever it used to see, locked onto me. Slowly it began to turn, its movements slow and deliberate, like it was aware of my every fear. It faced me fully, its hollow face staring directly at me, and in that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, pure, unadulterated terror. And then, without warning, it vanished. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. Mrs. Darrow let out a soft moan, her eyes fluttering shut as she drifted back into unconsciousness. I didn't wait. I ran. I grabbed my things, bolted down the stairs, and out the front door without looking back. I drove away from that house as fast as I could, my hands shaking so badly I could barely keep the car on the road. The next morning, I called Mrs. Darrow's family and told them I couldn't continue working there. I didn't explain why, didn't tell them about the figure, the whispers, or the footsteps. I just told them I couldn't stay in that house anymore. A week later, I found out that Mrs. Darrow had passed away in her sleep. They said it was natural causes, but I knew better. Something else had taken her. Something that had been waiting in that house for a long, long time. I've never gone back to the Darrow estate, and I never will. Some places hold on to things, dark things that don't belong in this world. And whatever was in that house, it's still there, waiting for the next poor soul to walk through the door.